In a genetics lab in Khartoum, Sudan, a scientist circled a number on a printout. The number was 62. He didn't react the way you'd expect. He just looked at it. For a long time. Because Dr. Hassan knew exactly what that number meant, and what it meant was going to change the way the entire field thought about human history. That number came from a study published in 2008. Hassan and his team at the University of Khartoum had been analyzing Y-chromosome data from Sudanese populations, looking at which genetic markers showed up and how often. And when they got to the Dinka people of South Sudan, they found that 62% of the men carried something called Haplogroup A-M13. Now, if you don't know what a haplogroup is, think of it like a genetic family name passed from father to son, unchanged for thousands of generations. And haplogroup A is not just any family name. It is the oldest branch on the entire human Y-chromosome tree. It predates every single migration out of Africa. It is older than the ancestors of every European, every Asian, every person from the Americas or the Pacific, every human being alive today whose family history lies outside sub-Saharan Africa. So here's the thing. We've spent centuries asking the wrong question about the Dinka. The question we always ask is, where did they come from? But that's not what the DNA is asking. What the DNA is asking, quietly, in the language of chromosomes and frequency distributions, is something much bigger. Where did everyone else go? The Dinka didn't arrive somewhere. They were already there. Every other population on Earth is descended from people who left their world. When there are somewhere between 4 and 6 million Dinka people alive today, more than half the adult men carry this genetic signal, not as a faint trace, not as a historical artifact, but as a dominant, living, replicating marker inside their bodies right now. They survived drought. They survived slave raids. They survived 2 civil wars. The oldest patrilineal lineage on Earth is not a relic. It is a living population, and it is living through an active catastrophe. If you've ever wondered where humans really came from, and I mean really not the textbook version, subscribe now, because what we're about to get into goes much deeper than you think. Before we go further, drop in the comments. Does your family carry any oral tradition about where you originally came from? A place always mentioned, a story passed down, an ancestor nobody can fully explain. Because by the end of this video, you may be looking at that story from a completely different angle. The story has not adjusted, but the data has. Here's something people don't usually say out loud in population genetics. Most ancient populations are ancient in the way that sediment is ancient. Compressed, buried, present only in trace concentrations, if at all. But the Dinka's genetic signal isn't sediment, it's bedrock. It's what everything else was built on top of. A 62% frequency after 60,000 years doesn't just mean old. It means something resisted the forces that erased every equivalent signal everywhere else on Earth. And to understand how extraordinary that is, you need to know what those forces look like. In 2009, Dr. Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania led the largest genomic survey of African populations ever conducted at the time. Her team's paper, published in Science, confirmed that Nilo-Saharan populations, the broader language family that includes the Dinka, showed ancestry patterns consistent with long-term, deep regional continuity in the Upper Nile corridor. And then in 2017, Dr. Pontus Skoglund and Dr. David Reich at Harvard Medical School published their analysis of prehistoric African population structure in Cell. They found that ancient East African pastoralists showed a degree of genetic continuity from pre-Neolithic times that had no parallel in any population outside sub-Saharan Africa. But here's where it gets strange, because the Dinka did not exist in isolation. They existed beside some of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, and those civilizations were known for absorbing everything around them. Think about what the Bantu expansion did. It reshaped sub-Saharan Africa across centuries. Then think about what the Yamnaya steppe herders did in Europe. They replaced approximately 90% of Western European Y chromosomes in roughly 1,000 years. 90%. Gone, replaced, overwritten. That kind of genetic disruption is not unusual in human history. That is the norm. The Dinka's preservation is the exception so extreme it barely has a category in the standard literature. It's not isolation, it's resistance. And resistance implies something being resisted. Here's what makes that even stranger. When South Sudan gained independence in 2011, the Dinka made up roughly 35 to 40% of the national population, the single largest ethnic group in a country of over 60 distinct peoples. They did not persist as a tiny, sheltered remnant. They multiplied, they expanded, they competed, and they held that 62% frequency through all of it. So what kept the signal alive when everything around it changed? Because they didn't just survive. They survived next to one of the most dominant empires the ancient world ever produced. That boundary is visible in the genomic record, and what it borders is not what you think. In 2022, a team led by researchers at Emory University published the first genome-wide ancient DNA data ever collected from Sudanese Nubia, 66 individuals from the Kulubnarti burial site on the Nile River, dating from roughly 1080 to 1320 years ago. What they found was a Nubian population that had been steadily absorbing West Eurasian ancestry over centuries, genetic influence flowing down from Egypt, from the Mediterranean, from the north. Layers of outside DNA building up over generations. The Dinka's genetic cluster shows essentially none of that admixture at scale, while the Nubian populations along the Nile were actively incorporating outside lineages, which is completely normal for civilizations that trade, that conquer, that get conquered. The Dinka corridor held. And that's important because the Kingdom of Kush wasn't just a neighbor. It was one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. These were the people who built the Nubian pyramids. There are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. Most people just don't know it. These were the people who forged iron, who ran trade networks across northeastern Africa, who produced the 25th dynasty pharaohs that ruled Egypt itself. And the Dinka absorbed almost none of their DNA. This finding was published in 2017 in Cell, one of the most cited journals in science, and almost no documentary on the Dinka has used it, until now. Here's the twist, and this one matters. We've been taught that the Kingdom of Kush is the ancient world of this region, that Kush is where the civilizational story begins, but the DNA doesn't say that. The DNA says the Dinka's ancestral population is older than Kush, not peripheral cousins, not absorbed subjects. The ancestral substrate that was already present before the Kushite signal ever formed. They were here before the kingdoms arrived. They were here after the kingdoms fell. But the kingdoms are the interruption. The Dinka are the baseline, and the Dinka already knew this. Historian Stephanie Beswick spent years collecting Dinka oral traditions for her book, Sudan's Blood Memory. She documented that Dinka elders linked neighboring Nilotic peoples, the Shilluk, the Nuer, directly to named Dinka ancestors. They didn't see themselves as peripheral to Nubian civilization. They understood themselves as the older family. The DNA, published in peer-reviewed journals roughly 12 centuries after those oral traditions first formed, agrees with the elders. So if the Dinka predate the kingdoms, what exactly do they predate beyond the kingdoms? Every prologue has a people. This one has no name. The Dinka themselves are not the oldest layer of the genomic signal they carry. Linguistic dating places proto-Nilotic language emergence near present-day Khartoum at roughly 4,000 years ago. That means the cultural category we call the Dinka is relatively recent. The genetic signal they carry is not. Dr. Mary Prendergast at St. Louis University in Madrid spent years working on this specific question. In 2019, her team published something in Science that nobody in the field could quite explain away. They had sequenced 41 ancient genomes from Kenya and Tanzania, individuals dating from 100 to 4,000 years old, and they found that pastoral Iron Age individuals from that region showed direct genetic affinities to present-day Nilotic speakers, which means the ancestral genome that would eventually crystallize as the Dinka's haplogroup signal was already present and active in the East African pastoral corridor 3,000 to 4,000 years before the Dinka had a name. The cattle herders, whose bones are buried in Kenyan soil, those are the genomic great-great-grandparents of living Dinka men. This isn't just deep history. If you carry any East African ancestry at all, any Nilotic ancestry, what Prendergast found in 2019 is the genetic biography of your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. Now, here's the thing that stops you cold when you sit with it. The Dinka call themselves Jieng. It's a word that roughly translates as the people, not the people of somewhere, not the people of something, just the people. As if, at the moment of naming themselves, there was no edge that needed to be specified, as if there was nothing outside them that required a distinction. They were simply what humans were. Actually, real quick, I want to ask you something. If you watched the last video on this channel about the genetic origins of the Nilotic peoples, you already saw the first piece of this. Did that change how you think about East African ancestry? Tell me in the comments, because what's coming in the next 2 segments is exactly what that video was building toward, and I genuinely need you to stay with me for it. The problem is that the people who came before the Jieng, the proto-Nilotic pastoralists, who predate the cultural Dinka by 2,000 years or more, have no confirmed name in academic consensus, no independently documented civilization. No monument that has been correctly attributed to them. Their only surviving evidence in the historical record is a Y-chromosome mutation sitting at 62% frequency inside the cells of men living in South Sudan today. That's not a gap in the data. That's a deletion. This deletion has happened before, on a different continent, in a different millennium, with the same precision. In 2016, Dr. Anna Sapfo-Malaspinas and her team at the University of Copenhagen published a landmark study in Nature. They confirmed that Aboriginal Australians carry mitochondrial lineages tracing continuously to the first out-of-Africa migration wave, approximately 50,000 to 55,000 years ago. Continuous, unbroken, preserved at frequencies that should not have survived 5 centuries of colonial contact and demographic catastrophe. And then Dr. Pontus Skoglund's ancient DNA analysis confirmed that the ancestral Nilotic component present in East African pastoralists is what the literature calls anciently diverged, meaning it branched off from other African lineages so early that it has been running its own separate course since before most of what we think of as human history began. 2 populations, different continents, different centuries, different genetic systems, 1 Y-chromosome, 1 mitochondrial, both carrying the deepest human ancestry signals on Earth. And here's what the same scholarship said about both of them. Aboriginal Australians were classified by 19th century European anthropology as the most primitive living humans, the furthest from civilization, the lowest rung. The Dinka were classified in the same era as a people without history, pastoral, unchanging. Far outside the story of human progress. Both of those classifications were published in journals, taught in universities, built into the frameworks that shaped how the world understood human development. And yet, the data said the exact opposite. There are 3 things this parallel tells us. The second one is uncomfortable. The third one ends the debate. First, the preservation of deep ancestral lineages is not an accident of geography. It requires something, some combination of cultural coherence, deliberate boundary maintenance, or sheer demographic persistence that resisted the disruptions that erased equivalent signals elsewhere. Second, the 2 populations most aggressively classified as primitive by European scholarship both carry the most ancient genetic records in the human species. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. Third, and this is the one that lands. The man carrying Haplogroup A-M13 in his Y-chromosome today is carrying an unbroken biological chain from his father, back through every paternal ancestor before him, past the pyramids, past the invention of writing, past the beginning of agriculture, all the way back to a man who lived in Northeast Africa before his contemporaries walked out of the continent and populated the rest of the world. That man's Y-chromosome is alive right now. It is being carried by a person whose name we don't know, in a country currently in the middle of a humanitarian crisis, in a body that the international community has primarily photographed for UNHCR reports. No one has told him what he carries. The translation has not reached them, and the silence around that fact has a shape. Not the academic papers were published, the data was indexed, the findings were cited by follow-up studies. None of that is in question. What didn't happen is the step after publication, the translation from journal to village, from frequency distribution to the man carrying it. And that step didn't happen because performing it would require something the field has historically been slow to do: assign civilizational weight to data that reverses the direction of civilizational prestige. Professor Muntasser Ibrahim at the University of Khartoum has been making this argument for years. In his 2021 review, published in Human Molecular Genetics, he put it plainly: African genomes contain adaptive information, historical information, and deep ancestry data that Western genomics databases have profoundly underrepresented. He called the gap structurally ironic, because African populations carry the highest genomic diversity of any populations on Earth. The most information-dense human genomes in existence are the least studied. That is a statement about research resources. It is also a statement about direction. Hold on to everything I've told you so far, because what comes next is the reason this data has been sitting in journals for almost 20 years without changing the story we tell. Every civilization that called itself ancient was measuring from the wrong point. The Romans measured back to Greece. The Greeks measured back to Egypt. The Egyptians measured back to Kush. And the Kushites, the pyramid builders, the iron forgers, the pharaohs, built their world beside a people who predate all of them. A people whose Y-chromosome traces back to the root of the entire human patrilineal tree. And that people was not incorporated into the civilizational story as the root. They were filed under pastoral, under tribal, under without history. The compass was not broken by accident. It was pointed deliberately away from its own true north. Every human being alive whose ancestors left Africa is descended from people who departed from a world the Dinka never left. Read that again. The Dinka did not come from the ancient world. The ancient world came from them. Since 2013, millions of Dinka have been displaced by South Sudan's civil conflicts into refugee camps across Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, and into diaspora communities in Australia, the United States, and Canada. The oldest patrilineal lineage on Earth is being geographically scattered, not by genetic absorption, but by geopolitical catastrophe. It is not disappearing. It is being archived involuntarily across 5 continents, held in the bodies of people who, in most cases, nobody has told what they carry. If you want to understand where humanity actually comes from, not the simplified version, the real one, subscribe. Because this channel is going to keep pulling on this thread, and it goes much deeper than tonight. The framework hasn't corrected itself, but the bodies have been paying the cost of the error for 4,000 years. The conflict in South Sudan, which began in 2013 between the Dinka-dominated government of President Salva Kiir and the Nuer-led opposition of Riek Machar, has been framed in international diplomatic language as a political crisis, a power struggle, an ethnic conflict between neighboring communities, and all of that is true as far as it goes. But the genomic record adds a layer that no peace agreement has addressed, because no peace agreement has been written to address something this deep. Dr. Hassan's 2008 study, the same paper that gave us the 62% figure, also mapped haplogroup distributions across multiple Sudanese populations. The numbers are striking. Dinka men, 62% haplogroup A-M13. Shilluk men, 53% A-M13. Nuer men, around 33% A-M13, and roughly 50% of a completely different haplogroup, B-M60. There are 3 things this tells us. The first 2 are scientific. The third one changes how you see the war. B-M60 is a haplogroup common in Niger-Congo-speaking Bantu populations. Its high frequency in the Nuer suggests that during their southward migration out of the Gezira region, the Nuer incorporated a substantial Bantu-speaking population stream that the Dinka largely did not. Which means these 2 peoples, who have been raiding each other's cattle, defining themselves against each other, and now killing each other in a post-independence civil war, did not diverge from a single shared ancestor at the same time through the same route. They arrived at the same Nile Valley floodplain from different population histories, separated not just by politics, but by thousands of years of different migration paths. This isn't an explanation for the war. Genetics doesn't cause wars, but it does mean that the conflict currently being addressed by international mediators at the level of political negotiation has roots that are simultaneously much older and much more complex than any political framework was built to handle. Stephanie Beswick documented in Sudan's Blood Memory that Dinka oral histories carry detailed, named, genealogical accounts of slave raids, seasonal displacements, and multi-generational conflict. The memory of what happened to their ancestors is not metaphor in Dinka culture. It is specific. It is inherited. It travels the same route as the Y-chromosome, father to son, down through centuries. The families know which ancestors were taken. They have remembered it across more generations than most nations have existed. And the genetic fault lines that produce these population differences still map, almost exactly, onto the modern borders, the active displacement zones, and the front lines of the most recent violence. Right now, somewhere in Minneapolis, there is a Dinka man who left South Sudan sometime in the last 15 years. He works a job, he raises a family, he speaks English with his children, and Dinka with his mother on the phone. He has probably never heard the word haplogroup. He almost certainly does not know that his Y-chromosome has been studied, published, and cited in international genetics journals. He does not know that 62% of the men who share his paternal lineage carry one of the oldest genetic signals in the human species. The Minneapolis Dinka community is one of the largest in the world outside Africa, but so is the community in Omaha, Nebraska, and in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and in Sydney, Australia. The civil wars and displacement crises that began in 1983 and resumed in 2013 produced one of the largest African diaspora populations of the 21st century, scattered across countries and continents, embedded in cities that were built by people whose own ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, left the same African corridor that the Dinka never left. Think about what that means for a second. The genetic descendants of the people who stayed are now living inside the cities, built by the genetic descendants of the people who left. They are neighbors. They are co-workers. They are citizens of the same countries. And in most cases, neither group has any idea that this particular historical circle has been closed. Well, this is the moment in the story where I want to ask you something directly. If you took a DNA ancestry test tomorrow and it came back showing a connection, however faint, to the oldest human lineage on Earth, would you want to know? Would it change anything? Comment below, yes or no, because that's not a hypothetical. For a significant portion of people with any African ancestry at all, that connection is real. It's in the data. The Dinka diaspora is doing something that no forced migration in recorded history was ever designed to do. It is distributing the oldest patrilineal lineage on Earth into the genetic future of every country it touches. Not through conquest, not through assimilation, through survival, through the simple biological fact of people having children in new places and passing on what they carry. That 62% in Sudan, that number will not hold forever in the diaspora. Distance, time, and admixture will change it, but the lineage itself will not disappear. It will dilute, it will disperse. And somewhere, generations from now, a person who has never heard of South Sudan will carry a trace of Haplogroup A-M13 without knowing where it came from. Here's something nobody tells you about the way we measure human history. Every timeline, every family tree, every map of ancient civilizations, they all have a starting point. And the starting point was never chosen neutrally. It was chosen by the people doing the measuring. And for most of the last 500 years, the people doing the measuring started from themselves and worked backward. Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia. The places that felt like origins because they were the origins of the measuring civilization. But genetics doesn't care about the measuring civilization. Genetics just counts. And when you count, when you actually trace the Y-chromosome back to its oldest surviving branches, you don't end up in Rome. You don't end up in Greece. You don't end up in Egypt or Mesopotamia or anywhere that has ever appeared on a high school history classroom map. You end up in the Upper Nile Valley. You end up in the region that is now South Sudan. You end up among the Jieng, the people who called themselves simply the people, because when they named themselves, that word was accurate. The standard historical narrative has a shape. It starts somewhere in the ancient Middle East or the Mediterranean and expands outward. Civilizations building on civilizations, spreading, growing, reaching. It's a story of expansion, of radiation from a center. But the genetic record tells a different shaped story. It's a story of departure. The vast majority of human populations are descendants of people who left. The Dinka are descendants of people who stayed. And the ones who stayed are carrying the oldest signal. Before this video ends, I want you to sit with one question. Not as a thought experiment, but as a real possibility. If you are alive today and your ancestry traces back outside of sub-Saharan Africa, then the people your ancestors came from tens of thousands of years ago lived in the same world as the people whose DNA now lives in the Dinka. That they were contemporaries, neighbors in geological terms, and at some point your ancestors left. They crossed a land bridge, followed a coastline, moved into a territory that had never held a human being. They became the founders of every civilization that later decided to write the history of everything, including the history of the people they left behind. The Dinka didn't make it into that history, not as authors, not as origins, not as the root of the tree whose branches produced every non-African human alive. They made it in as footnotes, as anthropological subjects, as a fascinating pastoral people of the Upper Nile. But the tree has a root, and the root doesn't care what the branches decided to write about it. Professor Ibrahim's words from 2021 keep coming back here. The paucity of African genomic data is ironic. Given that African populations carry the highest genetic diversity on Earth. It's not just ironic, it's diagnostic. It tells you something about which direction the field was facing when it decided what was worth studying. The direction is changing. Slowly, the data sets are growing. Ancient DNA from Sudan, from Kenya, from Tanzania is filling in the picture. And the picture it's filling in, piece by piece, burial site by burial site, haplogroup by haplogroup, is not the one that was promised by the standard historical narrative. The Dinka are not where the story ends. They are where it starts. Every human being alive is a chapter in a book whose first sentence was written in the Upper Nile Valley by people whose descendants are still there, still carrying the original text. Me still waiting for the rest of the world to look up from its own later chapters, long enough to read the beginning. The oldest human lineage on Earth is not lost. It is not extinct. It is not a fossil in a museum. It is alive, right now, in the cells of millions of people, in South Sudan, in Minnesota, in Sydney, in Nairobi, in bodies that the world has mostly looked past. That is not the past. That is a fact about the present that the present hasn't finished processing yet.